Hello and welcome to Wine Blast, or should that be Ni Hao and Ganbei? Because in this episode we are talking Chinese wine, and I would like to set the tone right from the outset with some poetry. Drink a cup of wine, the road ahead is long.
Are you just softening us up for the longest podcast episode ever? Yeah. I mean, I do actually have plenty of wine in front of me, so I can just drink through this, but we can't expect everyone to do the same.
No, okay, fine. I've been rumbled, foiled. No, that's not where I was going with this. That was a quote from the 8th century poet and wine lover, Li Bai, as cited in Janet Wang's fascinating book, The Chinese Wine Renaissance. And I just wanted us to kick off with some culture and a bit of history, because, that's the kind of thing we're going to be getting into in this programme.
Culture and history, right up your street. But let's not forget, we're also talking about some exciting stuff that's happening right now and looking to the future too. Here is a taster of what's coming up.
The Chinese wine quality has been improving, and the perception of Chinese wine no longer being this kind of pigswill. In the past 10 years, I think things have changed so drastically. It's like, Napa in the maybe 80s and 90s. I'm quite confident and hopeful about the future of Chinese wine.
We need something new, something different. That's, I think, the future for the Chinese wine industry. We must make something new to the world to attract the people pay attention to the Chinese wine. If we just make a Bordeaux, it's not necessary to find a Chinese Bordeaux. You just go to Bordeaux to buy a wine.
Natalie Wang of Vino Joy News and Professor Li Demei of Beijing University of Agriculture there, who we'll be hearing more from in due course. We'll also be tasting some Chinese wine. And what's more, you will be regaling us with stories, won't you? Because you're just back from China, where you were chairing a big old wine tasting, weren't you?
Indeed I was. I was in Xinjiang with the IWSC, the International Wine and Spirit Competition, where I was chairing a crack team of judges, including Li Demei and Natalie Wang, and we tasted and rated about 260 wines from all over China, and then we also visited some local wineries too. So it was an intriguing insight into Chinese culture and wine.
Okay, can't wait to get stuck into all of that. But before we hear about your exploits, about impromptu karaoke and horses on travellators, sorry, I couldn't help that. You're going to have to explain that later on now. It's going to be fun to look forward to, though. No, what I was going to say was we should kind of set the scene for our story, shouldn't we? Your stories, whatever. The context.
Yeah, right, yeah, absolutely some context. No travellators. China has a long history with pretty much most things, and wine is no exception. Some of the earliest archaeological evidence of fermented drinks, including wine, are from China. For example, at the Neolithic site of Jiahu in Henan, there's evidence of grapes being used in a fermented drink. And we have Chinese written records from a millennium or two before Christ referring to grapes.
But, there's sort of grapes and grapes, aren't there? And wine and wine, if you kind of...
More poetry?
No, it's not me being poetic, it's me trying to just, do you know what I mean? It's important to be specific, isn't it, about these things when it comes to China? Because, there are many different kinds of grape species in China, for example, but historically, they weren't the vitis vinifera, which we normally associate with wine, and which might, kind of be thought of as the European winemaking vines.
No, those vines probably came a bit later. It's thought around the 4th century BCE, perhaps along the Silk Road, and first introduced in the northwest in Xinjiang. And then there was another wave of vinifera imports in the late 19th century into Shandong.
Yeah, and then when it comes to wine and booze, there are different kinds as well, aren't there?
Exactly.
In China and Chinese.
Yeah. So, jiu, or Jiu, is the Chinese word for booze, essentially.
Right.
Then you've got baijiu, the grain-based spirit, which is huge in China and the world's biggest selling spirit by far.
Pretty fiery stuff from what I hear.
I can definitely agree with that. Confirm.
Yeah.
And then there's huangjiu, which is yellow wine or rice wine, like sake. And then putaojiu or hongjiu is grape wine. Now, grape wine does have a long and celebrated history in China. Chinese rulers and poets have championed it, as you've pointed out. But it never really evolved as a widespread drink of the people, unlike in Europe.
Yeah.
It was more beer and baijiu and rice wine.
Yeah, could that be to do with the geography and climate?
Yeah, I mean, China is vast, so you can find all kinds of different natural conditions. But for example, the interior of the country has a very continental climate, meaning hot summers and bitterly cold and dry winters. The indigenous local grape species, Vitis amurensis, can survive pretty well, but it's just too brutal for Vitis vinifera, which is, as we've said, the European wine vine. You know, the vines die, so for them to survive, they have to be buried in the winter, which is a lot of work. You know, equally, in more coastal territory, it's not so cold in winter, but you often get monsoon rains, hence the grapes rot. So this isn't the easiest territory for classic winemaking vines.
It sounds pretty challenging, to be honest. I mean, you know, but maybe things are moving on now from...
Yeah. So China had a pretty turbulent 20th century, but it opened up to the world in the 1980s and 90s. In terms of wine, foreign companies started to invest and local and state firms really began to develop the wine sector. The government backed wine for its health benefits and as an alternative to alcoholic drinks made from cereals, which of course used up valuable food resources. There were still some pretty dodgy wines, so-called half-juice wines, you know, blended with juice, sugar and flavourings. And mass-market Chinese wine has often been blended with foreign bulk stuff. But it was the start of China's modern wine journey.
So where are we now in terms of that journey?
Well, according to the OIV, China has the world's third biggest vineyard with 756,000 hectares, and that's compared to 945,000 for Spain and 792,000 for France. But most of that, maybe up to 90% of it, is for grapes and raisins, not wine. Which is why China is only ranked 15th in terms of global wine production, ahead of Austria and Hungary, but behind Brazil and New Zealand. To be honest, I think we should say getting hold of reliable data from China isn't the easiest.
But it's really interesting. It has such a big vineyard, so that, you know, there is potential.
Yeah. And while their wine production isn't the biggest currently, it has the potential to grow. Yeah. I mean, China's per capita wine consumption is still very low, you know, somewhere between 1 and 2 bottles per person per year. That said, both production and consumption has declined recently, but as I say, it's hard to trust the data entirely, and it does seem like Chinese producers are shifting from quantity to quality and to engaging an increasingly informed consumer. And that's really interesting for the future.
Yeah, it does sound interesting. I mean, what about sort of names to look out for in Chinese wine?
I think we'll come on to that. But I think if we maybe talk about the regions first. You know, when I visited, I was in Xinjiang. Now, this is in the northwest, up towards Russia, Kazakhstan and Mongolia. It's one of the biggest wine producing areas in China, very dry and warm, but with brutal winters. But one of the big names in terms of regions at the moment is Ningxia, which is in central northern China, where exciting things are definitely happening, and there's a lot of government support for wine there. And then you've got Shandong on the east coast, south of Beijing, where the modern Chinese wine renaissance really began over 100 years ago now. And then there's Hebei, Shanxi, and also Yunnan in the south, which is starting to make waves too. But I would say those are just the main ones, really.
So isn't Xinjiang where there's been a lot of human rights controversy over the persecution of the local Uyghur Muslim population?
Yeah, absolutely. So we raised these concerns before we visited, and we received assurances that the wine sector was very separate to all of that. But it is an issue. One of many geopolitical hot potatoes, you might say, right now when it comes to China. I think you can throw in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Ukraine, trade restrictions.
Yeah,
you know,
maybe we shouldn't get too bogged down in politics.
Maybe not.
That's for another show. But you know, how did you find Xinjiang from a general point of view? You know?
Well, for the judging, we were in a fairly remote area, quite a distance even from the regional capital, Urumqi. Things were pretty basic. The food was very different, a bit of a culture shock there. And for example, it was rare to have wine served with our meals, you know, which was a bit strange. But the people were lovely and hospitable. The landscape was vast and quite stunning when you had the backdrop of the Tian Shan Mountains. The wines, they were hit and miss, to be fair, but the good ones, they certainly showed potential.
Okay, we're going to come back to the wines, aren't we? But also some karaoke. I think just to let you know, you're not off the hook. You're not off the hook.
I can tell.
Meantime, why don't we bring in our first guest?
Good idea. So while I was out in Xinjiang, I sat down with two people to get their expert insider steers on Chinese wine. First up, Professor Li Demei, Director of Enology at Beijing University of Agriculture. Li Demei is one of the country's most experienced and respected consultant winemakers and wine educators. It's hard to overstate his influence on the Chinese wine scene. I began by asking him to give us some context by explaining which regions are the most promising in terms of Chinese wine.
I think for me, the most important wine region in China, first I would say Xinjiang, in terms of the history, because of the wheated vinifera introduced to China, first place is in Xinjiang. So historically, Xinjiang is important for the grape growing. And Xinjiang, secondly, Xinjiang is very large. So Xinjiang growing the largest vineyard in China. So there are so many wineries. They produce a huge amount of wine every year. So that's historically and also from the scale, I would say Xinjiang is the most important. But recently, since the last 10 years, I think you probably heard, Ningxia, another province just in the middle of China, Ningxia is very famous for the wine producing because the local government devote a lot on the, to push the wine industry. That's the two most important wine regions so far.
What are the biggest challenges in terms of making wine in China?
The biggest challenge is in the winter time. Wheated vinifera is developed in the Europe. So we often call the Mediterranean climate suitable for wheated vinifera. But here in China, we have the continental climate, so that's something totally different. So we found in northwest China, it's good, included Ningxia and Xinjiang. So it's good for growing wheated vinifera because the summertime is dry. But the winter time in this region is quite cold, extremely cold, minus 25, even lower. So the wheated vinifera plant will be killed by the extremely cold. So we must to protect it during the winter time. We develop processing it, bury the whole plants under soil in the winter. So that's the big challenge for Chinese to growing wheated vinifera to make wine. In the late autumn, after pruning, you bury the plant, and next spring, before the bud salt, and then take it out. It cost 1/3 of the total cost in the vineyard. So that's something quite expensive. So, and also, you manage your vineyard, every technique must adapt to, your plant, adapt for bearing, and, you can't just leave it like in Europe, in Bordeaux. So, I mentioned it's cold because, we bury the plants because it's cold in the winter. At the same time, it's very dry. So that's the two effects, cold and dryness of the air. So keep the plant under the soil. You can also keep the moisture in the soil and leave the plant, the branch, keep some moisture. So, yeah.
When you say, just going back to the cost of doing this, because it's time consuming, therefore costly, third of the cost of the vineyard. Does that mean it's quite hard to make wine at a competitive price?
Yes, you can say that. If you, after a few days visit, you talk with the producer, ask how much they sell, the retail price, compare it, you find, the similar wine in your home, you'll find it's quite expensive. So that's one thing. Another for the price of the wine, we say the Chinese wine is more expensive because it costs more. But on another reason, because most of the project is quite new, their marketing system developed not very well, not perfect yet. So that's also probably the marketing strategy not very precise, and the managing not perfectly. So a lot of things to develop. Yeah.
So would you say that the Chinese industry is a producing country? I mean, you are the 15th biggest producer in the world, but it's still quite young and still needs to develop its strategy in terms of everything, in terms of the winemaking, in terms of the marketing. Is that all still in development?
Yes, it's still in development. So many things, we must to develop.
Now, a lot of the wine, talking of development, a lot of the wine seems to be red. As far as I understand, pretty much 90% of the wine made and the wine consumed in China is red. Is that going to change? Is it changing, or is this still the norm?
Right now, no matter the imported wine or the produced in China, the wine produced in China, majority part is the red wine. And for the commercial reason, for the business reason, red wine, always you can put much more extra value compared with white wine. You can easily find a much higher price for the red wine compared with white. So the businessman always thinking, to get more. And then on the other side, Chinese normally like red color. So they like everything red, Yeah. So that's the white, for a business dinner or for the ceremony, the family ceremony, you need something, traditional. So the red, I don't think every Chinese consumer prefer the taste of red than the white, but they like, the fashion of red. Changing now. Since the last, I think, 2-3 years, people always talking the white wine developing the sales, especially from the coastal area, because that area, people eat a lot of seafood. And the people now find, okay, when we eat, we drink, the two things sometimes can get influenced, each other. So now they pay much attention to the taste of the wine. Then some of the consumer now also enjoy the white wine.
That's really interesting. Can we just go back a little bit to winemaking and grape varieties? Mm-hmm. So what do you see as the most promising grape varieties?
In China, it's Cabernet Sauvignon. So it's like in the world. Cabernet Sauvignon is on the top, and then followed by Marselan, Cabernet Grenache,
which is
the Cabernet, and also then Marselan. Marselan is a new variety. I guess since the last few days you taste a lot of Marselan.
We've tasted a few. Yeah. I've tasted a few.
So that's the top 4 variety overall, and then Chardonnay should be counted on the 5th.
And if you were to say what you'd like to see in the future as the most important, would it still be Cabernet, or would you rather see one of the others take over?
I think we have enough Cabernet so far. Even in China, or I easily could find the very fine, good Cabernet in the world from other region. But I think we need something new, something different. That's, I think, the future for the Chinese wine industry. We must make something new to the world to attract the people pay attention to the Chinese wine. If we just make a Bordeaux, it's not necessary to find a Chinese Bordeaux. You just go to Bordeaux to buy a wine. So I think for this reason, I think maybe Marselan has a very good potential. Because since last 20 years after Marselan reintroduced to China, it's already planted to almost every wine region. And we find in each region they give a very good result. But it's different from the region to this region to another region.
And why do you think it's having a good result?
I think it have a reasonable yield, a good quality. I mean, for example, in Xinjiang, you have stronger, the body and the nose. From the seaside, you find floral, fluent. It's different from region to region. That's also the thing important. And within the same region, if you green with the similar management, compared with Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Shiraz, the Marselan is always, you find interesting in the vineyard and the wine you made.
And if you were to tell me, so you can't really, if I said to you, what am I going to get if I buy a bottle of Chinese Marselan? What will it taste like? Is that possible to say?
Yeah, Marselan first, visually, it's very bright, brilliant. The color is purple. It's always, Cabernet Sauvignon, sometimes, you find it's very, very dense and, but the Marselan is in, bright purple and very fresh notes, fresh fruit. Sometimes you find, mint and lychee, the white fruit is very, fresh. Sometimes it's floral from the coastal area. You find the floral. And in the mouth, it's very juicy, some kind of sweet. That's also the Chinese like it. And not too tannic.
So it suits the Chinese taste.
Yes.
So how do you see the future for Chinese wines?
In China, we have something different. Alcoholic drinks. We have baijiu. That's quite strong in the market. So we have baijiu, we have beer, we have yellow rice wine. So then the wine. So the wine is among all the 4 alcoholic drinks industry, wine is the smallest. I believe all the other 3 alcoholic drinks consume the cereal, compete with the food, and for 1 billion Chinese, to get enough food, so the food supplement is always the priority. And secondly, where you green the wine to making the wine, that's the plant, that's the land, the soil can't plant other agriculture products. So it's very poor, it's desert, it's very sandy, it's not good for corn, for maize, for some other cereal. So as for this reason, I think wine should be a better future in the future.
It's got a good future.
Yeah.
Demei, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure.
So that's really interesting. What he's saying there is that wine in China can almost fulfill a political, a strategic role. It can be grown in places where cereals can't, and cereal crops are important for food security. So for both those reasons, wine is kind of well placed to grow.
Yeah. And he also said, actually, that he's definitely noticed the trend for young people to take much more interest in wine than previous generations and, search out Chinese wine rather than imported wine. So looking to the future, and given the general global trend to nationalism and isolationism at the moment, or onshoring, you'd say it's likely that we'll be seeing Chinese wine growing as an industry, not just in terms of volume, but also quality and diversity. And that's something that will be supported not just by the authorities, but also a new generation of interested, more educated Chinese wine drinkers.
Yeah, I mean, interesting what you said about price, though. Chinese wines are not the cheapest out there, partly because of the production costs and things like having to bury the vines in winter. I mean, that's mad, isn't it? It's so brutally cold and dry. They have to shift tons of earth on top of every vine or it will die.
Yeah.
I mean, that's extreme. That's hardcore, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, that doesn't happen everywhere in China. The coastal areas like Shandong are more temperate. But then the challenge there is monsoon rains and rot. So a different set of problems.
Yeah.
But the main regions like Xinjiang, Ningxia, Hebei all have to bury vines in the winter, which is expensive. Demei was also explaining that means you have to bend the vine trunks down towards the earth rather than leave them vertical in order to bury them. And of course, that's just not ideal. So you don't tend to get many vines surviving into old age.
Which again would be another cost, to replant, and also might impact quality long term.
I would
you
have
haven't got
thought
the old
so,
vines
yeah.
that other regions have. Interesting,
Yeah.
But also, as we were saying, just adds to the price in the final tally, doesn't it? So the future for Chinese wine would seem to be in the more premium ends of the market, focusing on the top stuff, because that's where it kind of has to play. It can't do the...
Yeah. Interesting too what he said about China needing to do its own thing, make something unique and different. With the Marselan grape, a big contender actually for a point of difference, and we're going to come back to that. But in the meantime, let's take a breath.
Hey, Michael Moon here with Tiny Bar Chats. Just want y'all to know to check out our podcast. We have a lot of exciting guests and a lot of exciting conversation.
By way of brief recap, China has a long history with fermentation and booze, but its modern wine industry is still young and developing fast. Challenges like cold winters and monsoon rains and high prices are countered by the advantages of an increasingly interested, wealthy consumer base. China's wine industry seems poised at an intriguing stage in its development.
So in a moment, we are going to bring in our next guest. But before we do, it might just be good to catch up on the very latest on the Chinese wine market, because there have been headwinds, haven't there?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in the noughties, the Chinese really got the wine bug. They started buying Bordeaux like crazy and domestic consumption ramped up. But then the bottom fell out of the market from 2011 onwards. Plus, in 2012, President Xi Jinping instigated a crackdown on government spending and corruption, which hit wine hard.
And then in 2020, the Chinese slapped heavy tariffs on Australian wine imports because of a wider diplomatic row, which was devastating for the Aussie wine sector. That was lifted in 2024, but the Chinese have just announced punitive tariffs on European brandy now too. So
yeah, the heady days are definitely over, aren't they? As I said earlier, this seems to be an era of isolationism rather than rampant globalization. So within China, domestic production, imports and consumption are all down. But you do wonder if this isn't actually a reset rather than a terminal decline as the Chinese wine sector matures and evolves into something leaner and more fit for purpose in the modern era. And let's not forget that China is still the 9th largest global wine consumer with huge potential to grow.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff. Okay, so I think on that note, we should bring in our next interviewee. Natalie Wang is a highly regarded Hong Kong-based Chinese wine journalist who recently launched her own platform, Vino Joy News, a fantastic source of information on the Chinese wine market. And you asked Natalie how the Chinese wine culture has evolved over the past 30 to 40 years.
Big changes. When I was young, growing up in China, in Chongqing, in southwestern part of China, where pandas are from, I always tell people that, drinking wine is not part of the culture. And when I was given a glass of wine, I remember at my tender age of 10 years old, family gatherings, oh my goodness, I just want to spit it out. It was terrible. It's like pigswill, for lack of better, description. It was awful. We had to add Sprite to it just to make it more palatable, to drink.
And this is Chinese wine?
That's Chinese wine. I mean, I won't mention name, but yes, that was the impression of Chinese wine. Growing up, I was never inspired to drink Chinese wine because that was the quality I remember. But luckily in the past 10 years, I think things have changed so drastically. You have a generation of winemakers, starting in Ningxia, making really quality wines, Grace Vineyard, Silver Heights. And now we're looking at so many aspiring winemakers, not just in Ningxia, in Shandong, in Yunnan now, making really interesting, exciting wines, not just Bordeaux blends, but really like peculiar varietals, even Malbec, Tempranillo, Pinot Noir, and Riesling. And someone actually made I was told someone even made a Saperavi as well in Xinjiang. So you have some really interesting and quirky things coming up.
So what would you say is then most exciting about Chinese wine right now?
I think the most exciting part is really the consumption growth. Interestingly, in the past few years, we have seen this growth and surgence of Chinese wine being consumed, preferred by local Chinese consumers, which is really encouraging. I think it's in line with the fact that the Chinese wine quality has been improving, and the perception of Chinese wine no longer being this kind of pigswill to be really respectable, decent quality, sort of terroir-driven quality even wines. I think it's quite interesting. I think I see that growing trend as well.
And in terms of winemaking, where would you say China sits in the global picture then now, given, if people are choosing it above an imported French wine or...
I think it's sort of like neoclassic style. It's not old world. It's definitely new world, but yeah, it's sort of hot. I mean, leaning towards new world. It's like, Napa in the maybe 80s and 90s, when just after the Judgment of Paris, and they're really sort of coming up and more confident, sort of the same. I see it the same way as Chinese winemaking at this stage.
At this stage, you think it's going to evolve sort of?
Certainly the leading wine producers coming out of China right now, they're so making really elegant, well-crafted wines, and they're so conscious with the environment. Like right now we have like Silver Heights, which is biodynamic, certified by Demeter. You have Puchang in Xinjiang, Yanqi as well, doing organic wines, and certainly more producers coming out and just sort of in line with the international standards.
So can I just ask you a slightly awkward question, probably?
Yeah.
The government's involvement in Chinese wine and ownership. I've read, and it keeps being said that, the government own all the land, then farmers lease the land from the government, but the government also seem to own wineries. How much is the government involved in what happens? And is it different for big producers?
As far as I know, I think, you're correct. I think government owns all the land, and then producers are really leasing the land from the government. I think even for state-owned wineries or privately owned wineries, the same story. I remember even reading actually from the Thirsty Dragon, that book written by Suzanne. It was really great. And then talked about Silver Heights, even Ningxia. Back then they were getting recognition, but the government, they want to earmark a plot of land for real estate property construction, and then they literally have to fight with the government to get that land back to themselves. So it is a little bit challenging. But today, I think more of the local governments recognize the potential of wine not just as a sort of consumer product. It's also a great way to boost local poverty. Because especially looking at Ningxia, even Xinjiang, where we are right now, you see a lot of Marselan local populations, people actually, living under poverty line or, try to make a decent life. Working in wine industry actually gives them that lifeline to sort of, have a better life. So I think that's how the government is seeing it more, and then sort of encouraging this industry on the whole in general. In terms of government support, and you see a lot of support from Ningxia in particular.
I have noticed, yes, I heard about that. And when it comes to drinking wine in China, who is doing the drinking? Is it all the younger generation or the older generation, a bit of both? Who likes wine?
Yeah, it's a good question. How much of the wine is being drunk? That's another question, really.
In general.
In general. Because a lot of times in the past, people buy wines as gifting. They buy the wine to send it to the partners, family members, and how much of it has been drunk, we don't know. But I think what has happened right now, at least from what I can see, is a lot of more young consumers actually come up and drink wine, because what they're used to is baijiu. Baijiu is really high alcohol. It's not something you can drink, on a daily basis. I think now more and more you see younger consumers coming out, even though the spending might not be as high as the boomers or the older generation, but they're certainly, exploring and be quite adventurous with the choices. So, yeah.
And adventurous within Chinese wine, or is it imported as well, or more imported? What would they prefer?
I think adventurous on both sides. sides. Definitely, they're more open-minded towards Chinese wine right now. And then at the same time, they're quite adventurous with imported wine. I'll give you one instance. Older generations, they like, even for gifting reason, they all buy Bordeaux, Penfolds, for gifting because it looks good. There's a certain price tag, they have to tick. So without giving you the price tag and roughly, okay, I know how much this is worth and you see the value of it. But now younger generation, they don't want to drink that type of wine anymore. They don't drink what they were told. It's more about what they want to try nowadays. So I think that's a big switch. Sort of explains why the consumption decreased a little bit. But I think it's part of the market where you're cultivating real wine drinkers rather than sort of wine gifters.
And is it becoming more, therefore, of an everyday beverage?
I think it's heading in that direction, but it will still take a lot of time. Certainly not everyday wine beverage. I wish that's the case, because if you look at China's per capita consumption, it's like 1 liter. It's really low. We have a long, long way to go.
And I've noticed we don't tend to be given wine with our meals. Is there not really a culture of drinking wine with food, or does it happen in restaurants?
I think it's just, the culture is not there. The consumption habit is not there yet. They're so used to drinking tea with their meal, and wine is something, okay, maybe with family and friends, going out to the restaurants when I'm entertaining some of my business partners, and then that's something they choose. But hopefully we can change that very soon.
And is there a move from red wine? I mean, at the moment there's a big, China is known for making and drinking red wine, 90% pretty much.
Yeah.
Is that going to change?
I think so. Right now, just looking at the data and the consumption trends, definitely happening in that direction. For instance, even looking at the imports data, you see red wines, with the exception of Australian wines, all decreasing. But then luckily you see New Zealand and Germany growing really fast because Sauvignon Blanc and Riesling are massively popular. Even just during lunchtime, I was chatting with Professor Demei, on JD.com, China's biggest e-commerce retailing website. German Riesling is the top searched category, for all of wines. So that just goes out to say, the real consumers are, more and more consumers at least are looking at white wines.
That is interesting, isn't it? And if you were speaking to someone who'd never drunk Chinese wine before, which I think in the UK there are probably a lot of people who have never drunk Chinese wine, is there a way of describing it?
Oof, it's so hard to how would you describe it? It's so vast, even just looking at China, it's like the size of Europe. It's very hard to put in, simply summarize. What would you describe as a European wine style? It's very
You're right. Yeah. No, fair riposte. And why don't we see more Chinese wines outside of China?
I think a lot of the wines are not exported. I would say 95% of wines produced in China are drunk within the country. So really a tiny portion is exported. And also I think probably the price point, it's not the cheapest wine on the planet. So when you reach a certain price point and then you have so many choices, I think especially consumers in the UK, you guys are spoiled with the choices.
Yeah.
So really to convince them to try something, a little bit new, a little bit exotic, and really not sure how the quality is. It takes a lot of convincing work.
Do you think it'll happen?
I think hopefully soon it will happen.
Okay, so final question. What do you see as the future for Chinese wine?
I'm quite confident and hopeful about the future of Chinese wine. Like I said before, I think it's going sort of on the same trajectory as Napa. Definitely we'll see more Chinese consumers choosing and drinking Chinese wine, chiefly because the quality of the wine has improved so much. And I will see a new, more and more younger generation sort of, going into this industry and making wine, for completely driven for their passion. I think we are seeing more sort of aspiring young makers who studied in France, in Burgundy, in Australia, returning back to China and making like really interesting, quirky wines. So I think, a lot of reasons to be hopeful about the market, even though the market at the moment is a little bit tough. But yeah, we'll see.
Natalie, thank you so much.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be on the podcast. Thank you for having me.
The same trajectory as Napa. That's quite a bold prediction. I find that intriguing.
Yeah, but it kind of ties in with what Lee Demei was saying. You know, there is a general feeling that Chinese wine is developing and evolving, and it will have a lot of domestic consumers supporting it. You know, you're talking over 1 billion potential consumers with what is currently a very low per capita consumption. Yeah. So even if exports aren't huge because of the price or whatever, the likelihood is that Chinese wine is going to be a major player in the future.
Yeah, because baijiu is huge, isn't it?
Absolutely. Oh my goodness, yeah. So The Economist recently was reporting on this and writing how the biggest baijiu producer, Kweichow Mutai, is worth $313 billion. That is more than Coca-Cola, way bigger than Diageo, the biggest Western distiller. You know, the market capitalization of big baijiu exceeds $500 billion. So that gives you a sense of the potential on the drinks front here.
Yeah, so I think it's sort of interesting to try to get our heads around what exactly this will mean in terms of the wines themselves. You know, what is the Chinese wine of the future that you refer to? You know, is it going to be big, hearty Bordeaux-style blends, which is pretty much what's been the norm until now, or is it going to be other things like, I don't know, Marselan, like you say, or what Natalie mentioned, Malbec, Tempranillo, Riesling, Saperavi, or whites, or fizz, or orange? You know, what is the future?
Well, we've got some wines here that might help us decide. No, but in general, I'd say it's still too early to make a call on that one. If you accept that China's modern wine era realistically began in the 1990s, this is still such a young industry that's just finding its feet. But they're at a major crossroads. You know, the wild enthusiasm of the initial love-in with wine has settled down. People in China are starting to get their heads around the reality of this thing, and it is intriguing.
And you think sort of new and exciting things will emerge?
Yeah.
Time.
I mean, you know, Natalie was talking about the Yunnan region, which is in the south near Myanmar on the edge of the Tibetan Plateau. It does have some wine history from French missionaries, but when Australian wine legend Tony Jordan was packed off by his employer, the multinational group LVMH, owner of Yquem, Cheval Blanc, Dom Perignon, etc. You know, he was sent off to find the best place in China to make a top-end wine. After 4 years' research, he chose Yunnan, which is high altitude and pretty inaccessible, but you don't have to bury the vines or weather the monsoons. And that's a place that's looking promising. You know, Natalie described it as being like the Burgundy of China versus Ningxia being the Bordeaux.
Interesting. I did love her comment about pigswill too. That was funny, wasn't it? But, you know, let's banish that thought from our mind.
I think so, can we,
We have
please?
wines here to taste that are definitely not pigswill. Should we get stuck in?
Oh gosh, yes, yeah, I think we will. So I've got two whites from Helan in Ningxia. Now, first up is the Changyu Moser Cabernet Sauvignon Blanc de Noir 2023. So a still white wine made from the red Cabernet Sauvignon grape. And you know what? It's very drinkable. You know, it's a bit different. There's some black currant fruit, but also pear, apple, quite rich in terms of flavour and texture. I mean, sort of rounded, probably more than rich. Bit of spice there, but really good with food. And, you know, I would say not bad for £19.
Yeah, no, it's pretty easy going, isn't it? And something a bit different, white Cabernet Sauvignon, you know, it goes down very nicely.
Then, my second wine here, we've got something ostensibly more familiar, Chardonnay. Now, this one's from Silver Heights, a winery that Natalie mentioned, a biodynamic producer in Helan. And this is their Chardonnay Reserve 2021, 12.5% alcohol. It's aged for 8 months in new French oak barrels. Now, you might think you're on familiar territory with oaked Chardonnay, but actually this one is pretty funky, isn't it? And I quite like it for that. You know, it's quite artisanal and characterful, I would say, rather than stereotypical. You've got some some bruised apple. It's quite mealy. It's spritzy, which is surprising. It's just a bit funky.
Yeah.
Quite ripe, but also fresh and just different.
Yeah, which I guess what you want with a Chinese wine, right? You want a bit different. So, talking about points of difference, Li Demei mentioned the Marselan grape variety, and I've got one here, the pigswill Marselan Reserve 2019 from Ningxia as well. What I liked about this one was that you get tons of complexity and sort of bang for your buck. There's sort of lavish, sort of rich, ripe dark fruit here. There's dark chocolate, woody, almost sort of minty complexity. But then, it finishes quite fresh and lifted with lovely sort of juicy acidity and a gentle bittersweet twang.
Yeah, and it's not as tannic, is it, as Cabernet Sauvignon would be. It's dense, but also quite soft. Sort of a winter casserole wine, isn't it?
Totally. Although, in a way, that's also what I criticise about it. It's a bit international. It kind of, it sort of ticks boxes without really showing any intrigue or defining characteristics. I'd love to see Chinese Marselan showing us in the glass why it's unique and different. Plus, I think this one, doesn't it? It comes, just looking at this bottle, in a very, very heavy bottle, which is just not the way forward.
No, I totally agree.
When it comes to sustainability,
totally agree, especially on the bottle front. That's exactly what I found when I was in Xinjiang. We had so many heavy status symbol bottles, and they just seem horribly out of step with forward-thinking wine producers around the world, who are moving towards lighter bottles, which mean a lower carbon footprint.
But we were going to just explain a little bit, or talk a little bit about Marselan itself, weren't we?
Yeah, of course, yeah. So Marselan is interesting in China. This variety is a cross of Cabernet Sauvignon with Grenache, originally developed in southern France, but which was taken up in China. And they're seeing it as a potential point of difference. No other notable region around the world majors on Marselan.
Yeah.
And it seems to work well in China. As Li Demei said, it can reflect terroir and it suits the Chinese taste, so it is one to watch. But I think it would be great to see a bigger emphasis on elegance and freshness in more of the Marselan wines.
Yeah. Now, while Marselan may be promising, as things stand, unless I'm much mistaken, it's Cabernet Sauvignon that still dominates Chinese wine production.
Absolutely, yeah.
Which is fair enough. It's the widest planted wine grape in the world. It's well known. The Chinese fell in love with Bordeaux. It's all entirely understandable. The question is it right for China moving forwards?
Ooh, the million yuan question. Well, we've got two here, both from Changyu Moser in Ningxia. First up is the Moser family Cabernet Sauvignon 2022, 15% alcohol. Now, this is an intriguing wine, isn't it? It's almost hard to rate because it has this very leafy, green, woody Cabernet Sauvignon character, a bit like roasted peppers or green beans. But then also this baked fruit, slightly oily texture and spicy warming alcohol. So it's almost like a sort of a mixture of underripe and overripe, but still quite varietal and with this quirky, interesting character. It's a bit rough around the edges, but it's certainly not bland or international.
Yeah, and there's a slight sort of bitterness on the finish too, which can work with food, but equally it can be a bit much by itself. So, it is, as you say, it's intriguing, and it is a bit different. And also next up, we've got Changyu Moser's top bottling, which is Purple Air Comes from the East. And that's just not just me being poetic again. That is the name of the wine.
It is actually written there, isn't it, on the wine?
2019, so it's a bit of age. This again has those same elements of kind of roasted pepper and warm earth, but it's kind of dialed down here. Because the age is also softening into more tobacco, cedar and leather characteristics, which are really kind of nice. I love the tannin here. It's very cultured, sort of elegantly drying. So the wine itself is big, but it's stylish. Again, slightly bitter on the finish, almost like, that hint of stewed tea. When you stew tea and you drink it, it's kind of quite drying. But again, that can work with food.
Yeah. So two really interesting wines there. The main issue for me, and I think for both of us, frankly, is the price. It's actually hard to find the correct price. I'm going to say that right now, but I think I'm right in saying this. The first one that we had there was about £75, and then the Purple Air is nearer £170 a bottle. Now, this goes back to what Li Demei and Natalie were saying. These wines are really expensive, particularly on export markets. And that's a barrier to people trying them.
Yeah, that's a real shame, isn't it? You know, and just I'm actually looking back to the Chardonnay. The price for that's £42. The Marselan is £43. You know, by the way. So again, you know, not cheap wines.
No.
One other thought that I'd venture: are Bordeaux varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon really right for, you know, for what is in many places an extreme continental climate? You know, Bordeaux is a maritime climate, and as we've discussed, you know, the world already has lots of Cabernet and Merlot. What about varieties more suited to these kind of extreme conditions, like, I don't know, Malbec or Tannat or Aglianic or Grenache or whatever, you know, or whites along the same vein?
Yeah, I mean, it would be good to see other things emerging over time, definitely, including more whites. And as we say, an emphasis not just on bold, rich international styles, but on elegance, terroir expression, diversity.
Yeah.
You know, the best Chinese wines are worth trying, but to my mind, as a very general rule, they're just not yet distinctive or refined enough to be worth the price. But watch this space, because there is quality and, just as importantly, huge potential.
And I hear there was both quality and potential on show in your impromptu karaoke.
Oh, Lord. I was really hoping you'd forgotten about that.
No, like an elephant.
I should have known better. Okay. So yes, while we were there, yes, we did have one particular dinner involving various state officials, all quite grand.
Fun dinner, was it? Yeah.
But then someone broke out that karaoke, and I felt I had to represent our proud nation, or it would have been poor form. Is all I'm going to say.
Of course you did. Of course, notorious wallflower that you are. So what did you sing?
Well, I'm pleased to say it wasn't me alone. I was joined by a couple of members of the judging team.
You roped in a couple of... Right.
Bless them. And
poor
we
people.
sang Summer of '69, of course.
Oh.
Total classic.
Can't go wrong. I think we actually have video evidence of this, which may have to go up on the show notes alongside all the wine details and other links. But plus... what we can also post is a video of horses on travellators. Now, can you tell us a bit more about this one too?
Oh, yeah. So in addition to visiting local wine producers, we also went to see a stage show in Xinjiang. And as far as I could tell, I'm not sure, but it seemed to involve a lot of heroic action. And yes, we had warriors riding horses on travellators on stage. Very impressive.
Okay, so we'll stick a load of intriguing videos and photos of your visit on the show notes and social media. So look out for those. Any final words about China and its wines?
I think one of the biggest things that needs to change, and I speak from first-hand experience, is for the Chinese in general to start seeing wine as something to be enjoyed with a meal, you know, both as an aperitif and to have with the food, and not just as alcohol to be drunk afterwards. And then, as we've already said, you know, in terms of winemaking, there needs to be a move away from international style wines that are just copycats of others, you know, to wines that offer something unique and different. Maybe, as we've said, using the likes of Marselan for the reds and Petit Monseigne, actually, for the whites, which we haven't really talked about, but which is a really promising white variety in China.
Okay, so there we have it. It may have been a longish road, but we drank our wine, so all is well. By way of closing summary, China has one of the world's biggest vineyards, and its wine scene is developing fast. For now, the wines remain a bit hit and miss, also pricey, partly due to production costs, like having to bury vines in winter. Bordeaux grapes still dominate, and it's not uncommon to find lots of oak, extraction, alcohol, and heavy bottles. But the best wines are impressive, and the likelihood is that Chinese wine will be a major player in the future. The question is, will it be mostly drunk in China, or will the rest of the world get to enjoy it too?
Thanks to our guests Demei and Natalie Wang. Check out our show notes for more details on susieandpeter.com. If you've enjoyed this show, please do share the love, rate, review and recommend. Until next time, cheers.